In this video, we'll be seeing a creation of a basic Excel like UI used by doing prompts in deepseek. So this just supports file loading and doing some basic functionalities like the formula evaluation. For example, I can do a sum giving reference of cells or an average like this. So we'll see what were the prompts and how was the result. And yeah, on double click we can get the formula that was used. So this was not something that deepseek initially implemented. I had to give further prompt to let it do that. So let's go to the prompts and we'll see. So this was my initial prompt: build an Excel clone using node.js as backend and add HTML for UI. HTML should have a file menu with sub menu that lets me choose an Excel file from my machine. Then it sends it to backend. Backend should be able to open .csv and XLS files and send the data to the front end. The Excel on the front end should have the formula processing capabilities. For now, just support some formula. So I started with a simple code that have the capability of just some formula. So later on I can modify it. So it created this as a backend. Use Express.js, and for reading the Excel or the CSV file, you use some libraries like these: CSV parser and XLS. It just has one API slash upload to upload the file and send its content, process and send data. And it's running on port 3000. This was the package.json with the dependencies we just saw. Now this is the front end, has some CSS, some basic HTML, and most of the things is done by the script where it creates a basic Excel like UI, and then it gets modified as we load that file. So coming to our next prompt, I asked it to create a test CSV content. So it shared this one. I just repeatedly copy this to create more data. So this is a file that I have. And yeah, coming back to next prompt. So when loading data from file, I want some additional rows and columns to be added where formulas can be written. So initially when it implemented, when I was loading the file, it was not leaving any empty cells below the last data. So if the CSV file has 30 rows, it was creating just 30 rows. So after this prompt, it did some modification. Instead of getting the columns and rows from the Excel, it was doing math.max of 10 or data calls. So whatever suppose the number of columns coming from the Excel is 12. So between 10 and 12 it will choose the max. So 12 will be that, and then on top of that it is doing a plus 2, just as I added in my prompt. So I needed 2 additional columns and 4 additional rows. So similarly for the 4 additional rows, it created a total rows during a math.max for data rows coming from number of rows coming from the data or 10. So whatever is the max of these two plus 4. Then the usual logic, whatever additional things were there. Now this time it did not send me the same code from for the entire HTML, so I had to put it in the required place. Like this was a display data function, which I had to modify, and it even left I think not in this prompt. In some of the prompts, when it replies, it gives a dot 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 rest pass goes here, something like that. So be careful while copying it next time. It might delete something you had in the from the previous prompt. So this time it was entire implementation of display data, but sometime it does. I will show you there was some prompt in the below where it removed some part of it. So next was, can you simplify the formula calculation logic by having the cell ID like a by having the cell ID etc. depending on the row and column to make it finding easier, to make finding the cells easier. So what it was doing was the formula calculation equal to sum, that was not working in this initial implementation. So I noticed it was using some complex logic. Again, it was doing an irrelevant thing where going by the cell and column that I have provided in my formula, it was again looking at the whole table. First, it was finding out which cell and column matches it, and then it was trying to do the formula. So there was some error in that one. So instead of doing that, I asked it for every input cells, you have some data reference which you can directly, like for example, if a cell is A1, so why not directly have its ID as A1 and do a document dot query selector hash A1 and directly get it instead of re-evaluating it based on the TR and TD. So still did not do, but it simplified the logic a little bit and it was able to calculate it. So here you can see this did some modification here, and then it gave a comment, rest of the event listener remains the same. So be careful of these lines when you encounter something like this. You cannot paste it as it is. You will have to find where this for loop start and only add the modified lines here. So I think in this case, the modified lines were these. It introduced a function get cell reference, and these three lines basically modified here. And these below part will be here. Then this was the new function that it is calling here get cell reference, which it implemented. And then in evaluate function also there were some modifications. Okay, now okay, coming to the next prompt. So what was happening at this point was it was calculating the formula now, whatever value, but the problem was it was doing it on blur event. So when suppose I was typing a formula in a cell, then I had to click on next cell to get it actually evaluate. So I asked it to not just on blur, you should also do it on click of enter button on the cell. So instead of just this event listener or on blur evaluate where it was calling the event evaluate formula, it should do it when even the enter button is pressed. So it did implement it. This was the same thing that was earlier. Then it added a key down event and checking if the e dot key is enter, then it is again calling the event evaluate formula. Now there was some additional things that were added. This was needed because for the UI it doesn't know on click of enter which cell it needs to go. This is not something that HTML can do on its own. So it had to write logic to find the next cell where it should go, and then it had to call next input dot focus on that. So this was what it did next. Uh, Coming to the next one, also don't remove the formula after evaluating. So what was happening after I do equal sum b1 to b30, it was calculating the sum, and then there was no trace of the formula left. So I had no way to go and edit the formula that I used last time. So what I asked is when when the cell with the formula are double clicked, it should show the formula that was used and let me edit it. And when it blur or enter is pressed, again the formula should reevaluate. So it implemented these things. So basically it put an input dot dataset dot formula where it stored the current value. Okay, so current value was the formula. It stored it to the input dot dataset dot formula, and below it asked me to add an event listener again, which on double click used to retrieve this value. So this dot dataset dot formula it was retrieving, and then it was reevaluating that. It also added some CSS change for the formula cell. That's when the formulas started become blue, just like here. When we are calculating initially, it was not blue; it was coming in the same color. So because of CSS, it's now showing differently. Coming back. So at this point, I had did some modification for supporting the average function, and I wanted it to do the rest. So this is where the vibe coding things come, where some developers claim that they did some application coding without writing any single line of code. That happens because every time you write a single line of code, you have to make the chatbot aware that you made these changes, and that is again a complicated part. That's why developers choose to ignore doing manual changes so that whatever context the AI model is having or the chatbot is having, it knows what else code I have currently, and based on that, it suggests additional changes. So I asked it. I modified some part of code to support the average function by changing calculate sum function to calculate and adding an argument for the operation. So like sum and average, I can pass it directly there. So I want to modify the calling function, especially the part instead of checking the formula starts with sum. So it used to do initially since it was just supporting sum. It had something like this: formula starts with sum, and since its length is 4, it was doing a substring by hard-coded 4 length. So this will not work if I start supporting average, sum, multiply, or some formula that is more than length 4. So I asked it to modify. So instead of this part, I asked it to make it more dynamic. It made those changes. It used regex to find the function that is there by removing the equal and the starting parenthesis. Then if it is not matching this regex, it returned syntax error. And if function is sum or average, then it is calling the calculate with the additional argument that I added in my implementation. So yeah, this was the last prompt. Until this, whatever changes I showed in the initial, this is the result of all these things. So yeah, that's it for this video.